Tickets are on sale now for Spotlight On's next live event, this time at the Royal Room in Seattle, Washington on June 22nd. Spotlight On, Improvisation in Music and Life will be a unique program of performance and conversation between me and the James Falzone Division Ensemble. Together, we'll explore the nature of improvisation in music and how its principles can be useful in all aspects of life, for musicians and non-musicians alike. Different types of composing in the moment will be demonstrated, interspersed with interludes of discussion covering what each musician brings to and gets from the experience. In the Q&A session, audience members will become participants and access a rare opportunity to gain deeper insight into the art and science of improvisation. For tickets and other information, visit theroyalroomseattle.com. For those of you who cannot join us in person, we'd still welcome and appreciate your support in the form of a ticket purchase. If you can, please do. It would mean the world to us and to this important independent venue. Thanks. Hello and welcome to Spotlight On, a production of 23 Media Ventures. I'm your host, Lawrence Purrier. Today the spotlight shines on award-winning vocalist, composer, ethnomusicology researcher, and educator, Kavita Shah. Kavita's work sits at the intersection of modern jazz, the new creative music, and world traditions. The impetus for her visit today was her 2023 tribute to African legend Cesária Évora, Cape Verdean Blues. We discussed that music as well as her personal experiences as a lifelong New Yorker of Indian origin, her work as an advocate for gender and racial equality in the arts, and so much more. Enjoy. Thank you again for making time to do this. I really loved listening to the record. It was beautiful.
Thank you.
Before we get to that, there was something in your biography that I wanted to ask you about because it seemed so unique, and that was this offhand comment that you said you discovered jazz at age 10. That seems so anomalous to me. I wish I had discovered jazz at 10. I would have 10 more years of listening pleasure under my belt. But I'm so curious, how does a 10-year-old come across jazz?
Yeah, so I was singing in a professional children's choir called the Young People's Chorus of New York City, and I joined it at the age of 10. There were two divisions at the time. Now it's this gigantic organization. At the time, it was still very early in the organization's history. And so we had a junior division and a concert division. And I was 10 years old, so I was in the junior division. All I wanted in life was to be in the concert chorus because to me, they were just so cool. And they did really beautiful and complex music, and they were so tight. And musically, it was so compelling. 1 year later, I joined their division. Two of the songs in the repertoire were Tiskita Tasket, which of course Ella Fitzgerald made famous, and How High the Moon. In both of them, there were some really fun elements, like in a Tiskita Tasket, there was some choreography that we used to do, and in How High the Moon, there was a solo section, like the ornithology, the contrafact that Charlie Parker wrote on How High the Moon. They were the more fun songs. They were the more engaging songs. They were syncopated. I mean, they were just interesting. And I loved being part of it. And I loved doing the choreography. And I loved the aliveness of the music. And that was my introduction to jazz. And because of that, I started listening to Ella Fitzgerald and Billie Holiday through these two songs, being introduced to who they were and their work from a quite early age. I think it's funny because there's no real reason why. I was listening to hip hop at the same time. You know, I was growing up in New York City. It's interesting to me how I was really attracted to this music from the 1930s and 40s. And it wasn't to the exclusion of enjoying other music and my contemporary music, but it was just something that I loved and was attracted to.
In a very specific way, did that start a journey for you? Did you start to explore other jazz vocalists or jazz adjacent music, or did that come later?
You know, I was quite young, so I think exploring music was still, I wouldn't know how to do that as a child, but I did gravitate towards those recordings at home. My dad had a Dizzy Gillespie CD. I would learn some of the solos on that CD. Manteco was on that CD. And I remember just dancing around to it, embodying the music. And I liked some of the early swing music. Yes, it was the start of a journey. It was something that was deeper than, say, Brahms or other things that I was singing, that maybe I liked the music, but I didn't go home and feel a need to know more. But there was something about jazz that I think I saw myself or my own story mirrored in, and I found it fascinating for that reason. And I felt the sense of freedom or possibility in it that started a journey for sure.
It's really interesting because to hear you contrast it to something like Brahms or some of the other music you were exposed to or you were singing at that time, to someone who isn't necessarily immersed in a classical canon or is just sort of new to it, you're almost describing like the exact reaction someone would have, right? If you put some classical pieces to sort of an untrained ear, if you will, and some jazz vocal pieces, most listeners would probably say, oh, this jazz stuff sounds more alive. It sounds more bouncy. It sounds more, it's really interesting that as a child, even your ear recognized that and said, this is a funner way in.
I think I loved classical music as well. I mean, I was playing piano from the age of 5 and Western classical piano. So I don't see it necessarily as either or, as much as there was something in my life that I needed jazz for. I don't know that everybody would have that reaction. I certainly do, but I think there was something deeper there. There was something about coloring outside of the lines, of rhythm not being as strict, of, I guess you said the word fun. I think classical music can also be fun in some ways too, if it's done well and if it's done right. But I think it was more about something being different in jazz. And I've always felt different and outside of things. Even at that young age, that story attracted me.
I appreciate you specifically referencing Ella and Billie Holiday. I was, just as it happened, I was reading a piece today while I was eating lunch about Billie Holiday, and it was a little dated. I think the piece might have been written in the 60s. And so some of the language was dated and some of the assumptions were dated. But there was a point the author was making about how at that point in time when he was writing, that there was an element of Billie Holiday basically in all jazz vocalists. Like she was so profound in the same way that there was some Louis Armstrong in every trumpeter, that she was inescapable, that some element of Billie Holiday seeped into all vocalists. So here we are 60 years after that article was written. Does something like that resonate for you, or was that just an artifact of its time?
Sure. I think of Billie as, speaking of freedom, as just total freedom from structure, from rules, from form. She's just completely irreverent and doing her own thing. I think also the pure emotion. It's a kind of yin yang to Ella in a way, or for me, that's how I always grew up thinking about it, where Ella was perfection. Everything's perfect. Everything, every note, everything's in tune, and every word is well enunciated, and just everything is executed. Even in her improvisations, everything's very clean and controlled. And Billie, it's like a mess. But there's so much emotion, there's so many colors, and she's known as really someone who was imitating horn players. The way horn players would try to imitate singers, she was really imitating horn players in terms of stretching, and it's really about a sound and a tone and a kind of impressionistic color. Yeah, I don't know how you can't be influenced by her.
Yeah, a lot of those adjectives you used about her voice and her style, she truly is an artist who all those same attributes from her life are reflected in her voice. Even though she was known as a very good actress and interpreter, you would listen to her and say there is a life behind that voice.
Yeah, there's just a rawness and an honesty. I sometimes run away from this because I don't like that assumption that Ella wasn't emotional, because I think there's a lot of emotion in what she does, and just such a strong artist. It's not like she wasn't an amazing artist. it just was different. She was different. I think in many ways, her art was the place in her life where I think she had a very lonely life and she was a very solitary person. Her art and entertaining and performing was the place where everything is big and everything is controlled and everything's here. Billie, maybe it's a little more the same. Her life is a mess and the music.
A little more on her sleeve, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Her heart's on her sleeve. For Ella, she's coming to work and everything gets buttoned up. She was a really notoriously shy person, but on stage, she was amazing entertainer and extrovert. It's interesting. I haven't talked about this in a very long time. I'll have to go now after we're done and put some Billie and Ella on for myself.
Yeah. Listening to it's always better than talking about it.
Yeah, exactly.
Sabura. És vida, sap que nós de viver, paródia de noite manchei, sem maca sabura. Angola, Angola, e pousa, mamios catamata, mecora papaya caminho. Angola, Angola, e pousa, mamios catamata, mecora papaya caminho.
There's some other strands that come up related to that, which I'll come back to a little later. But another piece I wanted to ask you about, I hope I'm not making too broad of a stretch here, but something else I noted in your biography is you have a facility for language, or at least you speak a lot of languages.
Yes.
On a sort of an obvious level. Like, does that relate to your facility with music, being that music is a language, et cetera, et cetera?
I think it relates to my relationship with music, because I don't think every musician has this relationship. But for me, there's a very strong relationship specifically between language and music. I'm blessed with a very oral memory. If I hear lyrics or if I sing them once or twice, I pretty much remember them. I think there's something similar with language where it's about hearing sounds. It's an oral thing for me more than, I've studied and I can sit down and do all the exercises and it helps, but it's more about this living thing. Like, I speak 9 languages and I've gotten more fluent by actually spending time with people and immersing in different countries and different cultures more than just learning it out of a book or something. And I would say similar with music. I've learned the most by listening and absorbing to a lot of music. And something happens for me with learning and hearing at the same time that works with both music and language. And especially when they're together versus separate.
Do you have perfect pitch?
I don't think so. I don't know if it's a myth. I tend to know pitches. If someone asks me, if I say, is this a C? It's pretty much right. Because I know where they sit in my body, but I'm not like those genius, crazy people that are like, I can hear everything, or I can hear when something's off. I know people like that, but I don't give it much importance, actually, having perfect pitch.
Yeah. But sometimes it seems like it's a parlor trick, or that's the way it manifests. Let me challenge you and see if you can do this. And it's like a memory game or something, but
yeah, I think that's what it is, actually. It is a memory game. And for me, it's like I know the keys of my song. So I usually start singing the song in a key, and then I'll say, oh, okay, I'm looking for D, so that's D or something. But because, like I said, I know where they feel or where they sit in my body. Yeah, I think it's overrated.
And plus, I think it's inseparable from, to some extent, like extreme training too, right? I mean, ultimately, if you're around music and you're developing your ear and you're playing with other people, like, you're going to build that facility, I would think.
Yes. I don't see any need for me in my life to have perfect pitch, to call a pitch out, because my whole relationship with music is about playing with other people. Automatically, when you have another person, everything is relative. And plus, I have a duo with a bass player, Francois Mouton. When it's just a voice and a bass, it's a string instrument. His pitch is definitely relative, or he's playing on a different bass sometimes when we're on tour. But even within a song, he might go out of pitch for one note and then come back in the next note. So it's all bending. I don't think beyond physics.
Yeah. It's funny. In the context you just use as an example, it would actually be a curse, because you would be able to, like, the fact that the deviations in the instrument would actually probably be annoying or distracting.
Well, it's funny because it's a very hard thing to play voice and bass alone. And it took me a long time to really trust my instincts, because sometimes I would think I'm off. And then the next measure, I have to go back to what I was doing because maybe he was off for a measure. It's a kind of context where we each have to just actually hold our own fort and hold our own ground. And of course, you listen and you try to adjust a little bit naturally. But yeah, you can't always change all the time for other people, I guess.
Yeah. That's good as an artist.
Like a life philosophy. You have to sort of you have to own who you are, but then I think naturally the ear adapts. So naturally you hear something and it adapts without me wanting to. Like if I sing a pitch and someone's playing a half step away, naturally my body's going to go that way. It's just, we're not meant to live in dissonance it's a skill. It's hard. It's hard. So naturally, that's what the body wants to do. Yeah.
Oh, it's looking for that reconciliation, sort of that equilibrium. Yeah, that's
like, have you ever sat in a yoga class where people do Om at the end of the class? They say Om, and it starts with like many pitches.
Yeah.
And by the end, everyone's on the same pitch. And that's a very human instinct to want to match the frequencies around you. Yeah.
To switch gears a little bit, something that was missing for me in my understanding of your journey is, what initially brought you to Cape Verde? What was your connection there, and what was the pull there?
As we talked about, I grew up singing all kinds of music, and particularly was drawn to jazz, and I decided to become a jazz musician. Along this journey, I also got very into Latin music and Spanish and Portuguese languages. I majored in Latin American studies at Harvard, and I lived abroad in Brazil when I was 20 years old, studying Afro-Brazilian music and going very deep into the music of Brazil and Portuguese language music, and also ideas about the diaspora. It's during this time when I discovered Cesária Évora's music, who is a legendary singer from Cape Verde, West Africa, which of course was a former colony of Portugal. So they speak Portuguese and also a language called Cape Verdean Creole. That's the indigenous language, which is a mixture of African tongues and Portuguese. I fell in love with her music. And as I was learning about music from the diaspora and especially from the African continent that had a relation with Portuguese language, she was one of the big ones. But very luckily, just a few months after I discovered her, I was living in Brazil, and she came to Brazil to perform at a festival. It was a festival in the city of Salvador da Bahia, which is a African city. It's a 90% Black city. It was a festival called Ástica Brasil. So it was especially highlighting the connections to the continent. And this is relevant, and this is the research I was working on as well in Brazil. It's relevant because it's a country that suffers from a lot of issues of racism and of exclusion, especially political exclusion. Brazil never had, it's a racial democracy similar to the United States, but it never had, for example, affirmative action policies. There has not been as much social mobility for different classes and especially different races. So you often have politicians or people in power that look a certain way, including in the state or the city that's predominantly Black. So in the music of Bahia and the politics also of Bahia, they've often looked to the diaspora as inspiration and as ways to uplift themselves and make sense of this sort of local situation by attaching themselves to whether it's American civil rights movement or African liberation movements, just this kind of bigger identity of what it means to be a Black citizen. And I think for me, as a member of a diaspora, having grown up in the United States, my family's from India, and having grown up in the United States, always being told that I don't look American or I'm not American, always feeling told what I'm not, that resonated with me, this kind of creating your own identity, creating your own connections to sort of make sense of who you are. That's what I've basically done in my life. That was really inspiring for me as a young person, as a young artist coming of age. And in all of this, Cesária Évora from Cape Verde came to play at this festival 2 blocks from my house in Salvador da Bahia. She was just mesmerizing. For me, that concert was one of those concerts that stuck with me for the rest of my life. I can still feel being there. I can still remember the power that she had just being herself. Actually, there's something very similar. It's interesting we talked about Billie Holiday because there's something very similar in who Cesária was. All the stories I've learned about her. I mean, I've been with members of her family, very close friends, many musicians that she worked with that I now have the great fortune to work with. And all the stories of her are about this very irreverent person who just did not care about what anybody thought, was completely herself, had a huge heart, but also very obstinate. There's stories about some very important person like Madonna coming to see her backstage or the King of Spain. And she said, well, like, who's that? Well, they can just wait with everyone else, or they can tell them to have a whiskey and I'll come out like when I feel like coming out. She didn't pander to anybody. She was completely herself. There was an immense power seeing a performer and a woman and a Black woman embody that on stage. She was not entertaining. She was not smiling very much. She was really just delivering the songs and in the songs. And it was so powerful to witness that, to feel that as a young singer. And I loved the music. It was so beautiful. And she touched the hearts like mine of many people around the world. The fact that this person from a very small, very poor island nation conquered the hearts of millions of people around the world. It was the power of who she was and the gift she had. There was always this curiosity in the back of my head to one day go to Cape Verde, to one day understand her music more. It was this oasis, like this beacon of light of this is Cesária, or this is where she's from. And it happened many years later. It happened more than 10 years later, where I had already established myself a little bit as a jazz musician. I'd already started releasing music and touring, and I needed a break one year from the hamster wheel of New York, the subways that we're talking about. And I went on a sabbatical trip to West Africa and got to spend a good amount of time in Cape Verde and Cape Verde. Very luckily, in the first week that I was there, by a series of coincidences and chance, I ended up meeting Bao, the master guitarist of the country, who was Cesária's musical director and who was the master of the kind of music that she was known for, which is called the morna. It's a mournful ballad form. And we just became friends. The luthier I bought a cavaquinho from him, and I asked him who on the island could teach me how to play the cavaquinho. And he said, well, we have the best cavaquinho player in Cape Verde on this island. His name is Bao. And I didn't know who he was. So it was a really special encounter. And as soon as I got to his house, I saw the picture of Cesária on the wall and I heard him play. Then very quickly, I started plotting how I could put the cavaquinho down and just start making music with him. So that's what happened very soon. And we developed a beautiful friendship and musical camaraderie that developed, sharing my music, sharing his music, learning some of Cesária's songs that I loved. And it grew from there over a few years, over 7 years, actually, of going there, coming back, going again, formally with a grant from the Jerome Foundation, where I went deeper into the music and culture, and then eventually recording an album together, which is Cape Verdean Blues, which came out just a few months ago on Vocalist Records. It's been a really special, really beautiful journey.
We'll be back with more Spotlight On right after this break. Other than the podcast itself, the best way to stay in touch with our various goings-on is to be on our mailing list. To sign up, go to spotlightonpodcast.com and click on Newsletter. Thanks. And now, back to Spotlight On. As it relates to playing with Bao and other musicians, maybe from any of the areas really that you've visited and explored and spent time in and collaborated in, I've talked to other artists from America who have worked with artists in other countries from Caribbean islands and South America. There's always, I'll say it, and maybe I'll try to say it more artfully, but there's always sort of a power dynamic, right? Because especially the perception from the partnering musician of like, this person's from America, is there money involved? Is there exploitation involved? I've seen it more on the pop and rock side, and I wonder, does that dynamic manifest in the music you're making? Like, how do the musicians, do they have representation? Is there a formalized business there? How are they protected?
Okay, well, you're asking two different questions, because
yeah, I guess so.
Right?
I guess the nature of the inquiry is more the latter. Like, how is it safe for them to participate with the modern business?
That's a really good and interesting and complex question. It touches on a lot of things, especially today. I would say for me, as a cultural worker, ethics is at the forefront of my work. And I think I come to the table with, I hope, a degree of humility. I'm not just coming in and learning something and exploiting. I never planned to record an album. That happened years after I first started working with Bao. Just coming in with a sense of a pure love for something and sharing. And I think when you share with your heart and when your intentions are right, also you shine a light on those people. Like, it's not about, for me, extraction. It's not about taking something and then making it mine or building off of it, but instead this is something that I love. I want to learn it. And here's Bao, because he's the master of it. I talk about him here. I talk about him everywhere I go. His name's on the album as well, So for me, that's a collaboration rather than extraction. I don't want to become a Cape Verdean singer. It's not something that I want to exploit for my own identity or my own gain, if that makes sense. It's something that I want to share. And not everybody's like that. So I think first having the right ethics and the right attitude is really important. And I think also artists and other people feel that. I don't think if you were to ask Bao or the other artists I work with, they really think of me as Cape Verdean. It's very sweet. They speak to me in Creole. And actually, Bao even said to me, if the young Cape Verdean artists would research and value Cesária even a quarter of what you did, they would sound totally different. It's also meaningful for them, which is, of course, meaningful for me. So I think this actually comes from jazz for me, because jazz is about mentorship and it is about the older generations and seeking out that personal knowledge from the older generations and also seeking blessings. Is this okay that I'm doing this? I've asked that sometimes. Is it okay that I'm recording this music? Or do you think I should do this? Or, how do you feel about this? And sometimes I ask, and then getting that blessing from the older generation, for me, that's what I need. Then I don't care who else says anything, because I know that I'm cool with them. That's what matters to me. In terms of their own protection, Cesária's music's very famous. It made the people working with her very well known and made them a lot of money. And so there's a lot of copyright protections on all this music. And it's really interesting, actually, because some of the music was traditional music. So all of a sudden you have this hit and it's like, well, who really wrote that hit? there was a lawsuit for her song Saudade, the most famous song, because different people claim that they were the real authors, but it's also just this song that's been done over and over and locally and in different places. And who was really the first author? It's really hard to know. But anyway, now all those rights and laws are in place. There's also like a local version of ASCAP, or it's called SCM. It's a Sociedade Cape Verdean Música. For me as a professional, of course, any album I put out, I'm making sure that all my copyrights are in order and things like that. I can only speak about myself. I can't speak about what they can do or can't do, but I can speak about the philosophy and the ethics that I bring to the table with the people I'm collaborating with, where of course I'm making sure that everyone's getting paid fairly, everyone's getting recognition, any opportunity I get. I'm speaking about Cesária, and I'm speaking about Bao, and I'm speaking about the other musicians I'm working with and the traditions and what they are. I'm not presenting them as mine, but I'm presenting myself as, I hope, an interlocutor. I'm telling my story through this music. It's a story of loss. It's a story of exile. It's a story of diaspora. That is how I connected with this music. Cape Verde is a very isolated place. It's by nature been a place of migration. There's more Cape Verdeans living in the diaspora today than in Cape Verde. And so you have this place where you have constant migration happening, whether it's from the days of slavery or from the shipping industries for the past 100 years. Like there's a large Cape Verdean community in Rhode Island and in Massachusetts because they used to work on whaling boats.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Or today, there's a lot of Cape Verdeans in Europe. A lot of people went to West Africa. So it's, for me, the music is about that. It's about that kind of like impermanent quality and this searching for home. And that's the story of my life. That's that word. So that's what it means. It's this nostalgia, but for a place that doesn't exist anymore, or you can't feel or see or touch, which for me is connecting as a child of immigrants to a home that my ancestors had, but that I don't have access to anymore. And also living in a place where I'm constantly told is not my home, even if it is my home. For me, that's my connection with the music. I love the music. That's what it comes down to. And I hope that Bao loves playing with me, so we just feel good playing together. So that's like also what it comes down to as well. And that's the other side of cross-cultural connections, which is even when you don't speak necessarily the same language or have the same background or the same tradition, when it feels good or when it clicks, you have this common language to tell those stories. So my story is not quote unquote Cape Verdean in terms of my biography, but maybe the emotion. There's something there that can tell the Morna, can sing the Morna. And I think they connect to that, whether it's the musicians or the public, even in Cape Verde or anywhere that we play, really. And that's meaningful. Again, not trying to exploit it for my own means, not trying to become like the next singer of the Morna or something, but rather I'm telling my story through this place and this thing that I connect to. And I hope in the same time I'm elevating that music and bringing it to a larger consciousness.
That's very helpful. Thank you for going there. You really helped illuminate what drives the melancholy in that music and in that sound, because it's obvious to the listener that it's there, but the source of it is complex for a lot of the things you've talked about, the history of the place, and even, I guess, the current of the place, right? The present of the place. If so many people are still leaving to go find their fortune or livelihood or future somewhere else.
One of my closest friends there, he just left to do his PhD in London, and his wife had the store there, so she can't leave. And she's actually grown up in Portugal, a child of Cape Verdeans, and she moved back to Cape Verde. She's founded her store, and so now she has her life there, and they have a child. And it's so common, this kind of story of, well, we'll just figure it out, or, I guess we'll live apart for several years. It's just done. It's like part of the culture. I just see that happening in pretty much every family that I know. There's someone who's abroad, or there's someone who's left, or there's someone who's coming back. Another close friend, the father worked in shipping for many years. So they would go on the boat for, 18 months or 8 months, and come back for 1 month a year. And it's a joke because you have to make the babies with it 1 month that they're home, and then they would go away again. And then the next time they would come, the child would be a year older. It's just very much the history of the place. It sounds heartbreaking, but it's also reality. It's just life for a lot of people. I think also finding a place where this kind of impermanence is normal. The society is by nature a Creole society. There were no indigenous people in Cape Verde when it was settled by the Portuguese. They brought slaves from Africa to Cape Verde. And then, of course, Portuguese themselves or other Europeans settled. One interesting thing I find is there's a lot of Indian history in Cape Verde. I mean, there were Indians who were serving in the Portuguese Empire through their placement and power in India and in Goa, who would be stationed in Cape Verde. So many people I've met or seen, they'll say, oh, my grandmother was from India, or this family that lived on the corner, they were Indian. It's not like in Trinidad, it's not so present or so thought of, but at the same time, there is a history, and there is this kind of, speaking of jazz and speaking of, in general, Creole places and Creole forms, there is this kind of opening for someone different, I think, to feel at home there, because there are people that just look very different living there.
It almost sounds like you're trying to describe it's less othering.
Less othering?
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Well, you've mentioned a few times, being told about someone trying to tell you don't belong, or this isn't your place. That's the most aggressive form of othering or one of the more aggressive forms.
Absolutely. There's also a word in Creole called morabeza, which means welcoming. There's a song on my album called Un Abraço de Morabeza that I wrote with the elder trumpet player composer. He's in his 90s. His name is Morgadinho. And he wrote those lyrics actually about me coming to Cape Verde and learning to sing and sing the morna like a Creole. It's very, very beautiful lyric. Morabeza means welcoming. It's like welcoming with open arms. That's the nature of the culture as well. It's a place where I've felt very welcome. It's interesting. It's like I've felt probably more at home there than many places in the world. It's a place that to me feels like home.
Boben con nos deja, Boben nos morabeza, deja de morna se riqueza, deja de sambura, deja de beleza. Boben con nos deja, Boben se cultura, Boben disfrutar nos amizad, deja de Cesária, deja de saudade. Kavita, seja bem-vinda na nostinha, aprende a viver, moda.
If I may, what was the nature of your research when you were in Brazil? What were you doing? You referred to your research, and I didn't want to make any assumptions there.
Yeah, so I was talking about the Afro-Brazilian music that I was working with. I worked specifically with Bloco Afro, which is a kind of carnival organization in Bahia, and it was called Malé de Ballet. There's two other very famous ones called Oludon, which Paul Simon worked with, Michael Jackson worked with, and there's one called Ile Aye, and they're both a little more famous, but Malé de Ballet is also very well known in Bahia. It's kind of the third one. I did research exactly about what I was talking about how they used these international icons of Black consciousness to make sense of their localized identity. So by having themes of carnival and having lyrics that directly dealt with Blackness in an international framework outside of this local Brazilian framework, identifying with liberation movements in Africa and America, identifying with slave rebellions, and retelling their history in a way that maybe wouldn't be told in schools or in history books. Something that was very beautiful was they actually had a elementary school on their campus where they could control all these kinds of messaging they were giving to young Black children. So my thesis was called Experiments in Transnationalism, Constructing Diaspora in the Bloco Afro Malidibale. I think what it brought to me, aside from this very rich, beautiful experience, was a few things. One is music for me, I think, is about culture. And maybe that goes back to what we were saying about Brahms. And it's really about people, and it's about connecting to people. It's about what music means in the community. So it's one thing to go and listen to the music and think that it sounds nice and it feels good at home. But it's another thing to see it live and to understand what do those lyrics mean for this community that gets together every Sunday and gives this very positive image of what it means to be Black to this community that's very poor and very marginalized and excluded in their society. So when you see that happening and that kind of like social work behind the music or just the significance, the community ties, it takes on a different significance. And I think in whatever work I do, I'm always interested in just that connection with the audience and also with how music lives beyond the page, for sure.
Yeah.
And I guess that's what I was talking about the tuning as well, where it doesn't matter to me because all that matters is that the music is good and it feels good and people are connecting to each other. That's the power that music has. And that's where I decided, okay, I think this is what I want to do for the rest of my life.
I think this might be the proper seg point to ask you about your work with Origen.
Oh, yes. Origen is it's a collective of new Latin music, I guess you would say, or modern Latin music. We started it during the pandemic with a group of some wonderful artists. It was actually started by Arturo O'Farrell. It was a group that got together to think about new ways to present music. And so during the pandemic, we did a lot of online curated programs. I curated 2 programs. One was about the Lusophone diaspora, and one was about the Brazilian guitar, showcasing different guitarists from all over Brazil. And of course, the online platform meant we could connect with people abroad and connect audiences from the United States to Latin America, to Europe, to beyond. And that was really exciting. And they also put on 2 festivals in New York. I don't know where it stands now. I think it's not very active at the moment, but that was the impetus of getting together with Origen.
It's a fascinating organization. I wish I knew about it during the dark days. I would have loved to.
There are some great videos on YouTube of all kinds of topics, and I was really honored to be included, not being a Latino person myself, but having dedicated my life to Latin American music and folklore, and obviously the music of Cape Verde and the diaspora. Yeah, it was just, again, a really meaningful place to connect community and folkloric music and the meaning of what music is to different audiences. And I think we have this possibility in the next generation to connect across cultures and to use the internet to cross-pollinate these audiences. The album Cape Verdean Blues, it was just released on the label Vocalist Records. I founded that label, and our vision is exactly this. It's exactly to be able to have different artists from around the world. It's a global music label, but focus specifically on this idea that global music doesn't have to be this thing of the past. It's not necessarily quote unquote primitive music, because that's been some problematic part of the world music industry for a long time. You want to find the people in the village doing this kind of like music from long ago, but rather
the weird fetishization. Yeah,
exactly. Rather, you have people that are taking folkloric traditions and they're doing electronics with it, or they're putting a string quartet with it, and it's alive and part of the 21st century. So that's one philosophy that we have with vocalist. And another is the hope bringing these different audiences together. So the next release we have is an Argentine singer named Juana Luna, where you have this music from Argentina, Cape Verde, hopefully the Indian subcontinent soon, and so on, where those audiences can find each other. And there's possibilities for direct connection and meaningful connection. That's an important part of my work as well.
Before you go, there's one other thing that you talked about. I was reading the interview you did with Gwen Laster, the sort of you participated in the discussion. And it seemed as though in my reading of it, you were almost in real time processing your sort of relationship with or your manifestation of vulnerability in your work. I think it ties into the beginning of our discussion about Ella and Billy. And I think it's probably present for any art. You know, we could pick any name out of that artistic hat and have an equally fruitful discussion about the role of vulnerability. Where do you stand today in terms of your comfort level with embracing that, expressing that? Is it an ongoing process for you?
It's definitely an ongoing process. I come from a culture where vulnerability is definitely not cherished or welcomed. And I think also that's very much the culture that we live in terms of the modern culture. Everything has to be perfect. Everything goes on Instagram or on social media, and it's this final product. Or even vulnerability becomes like a product, you know, where people
or a weapon.
Share these long posts or something, and they're saying they're pouring their heart out, but it's also done in a way that's like perfectly curated and soliciting attention and likes. I think real vulnerability means sharing without knowing what you're going to get in return, and being okay with that, or being willing to open something up without knowing if you're going to be rejected. I like Brené Brown's work a lot on vulnerability, and I go to that. And it's hard. I feel every day as an artist, to some degree, there's a choice between being more vulnerable and putting yourself more out there, or taking a kind of safer route. And it is a challenge for me. But one beautiful thing about the Cape Verdean Blues album and journey, we did a tour of 25 dates in the fall. It was a pretty extensive tour and a lot of interviews and a lot of TV programs and so on. Because it's not my clear culture or my clear connection, I have to give some context to the audience or to the interviewer about why am I doing this music. And to do that, I have to say, because I have this melancholy that lives within me. I lost my dad quite young. I lost many family members young. And just having this sense of a home that I couldn't belong to, or I couldn't see or touch, which I think is a really universal feeling. But that's like the essence of who I am. it's really sad, and it's not like the first thing that you say when you meet someone, but I actually find that it really helps people connect to the music. Because when I say that this is how I feel, and so I found the Morna and I love singing it, people say like, I know what that feels like, because I think I had someone come and say, my family is from Norway and I left, and all kinds of people like can resonate with that universal experience, that universal feeling. And that's been really beautiful to see. Like when I open myself up or I share my story, it allows people to find their own way into the music. It allows that connection to happen. So it actually makes me a better artist and a better performer, and it makes my audience more engaged and interested in what I do. It's not easy, but that's what I'm saying has been a blessing with this project, is because it's different. I had to share it. It necessitates that I share those parts of myself, and it's been really beautiful to see that. So I hope I can keep peeling my onion and keep, being willing to share. I think it's a daily choice and a battle, and it's scary every day. It's scary to get up and put yourself out there.
Yeah. Some days it's scary just to get up.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah. Thank you for meeting me here and for having this discussion. I very much appreciate it. And like I said, I love the record, and I'm very happy to be able to share this little platform as a way to tell more people about it.
Thank you, Lawrence. And I appreciate your thoughtfulness in your research and in all the questions. It was a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you so much, Kavita Shah. And as always, thank you for listening to Spotlight On, a production of 23 Media Ventures. I'm your host and executive producer, Lawrence Purrier. We're produced and edited by Michael Donaldson, with theme music by Q Burn's Abstract Message. If you'd like to support our work, please rate and review us wherever you listen to podcasts, and then go visit us online at spotlightonpodcast.com. There you'll find our free episode archive, weekly postings on our official blog, and a bunch more. Thanks for listening, be safe, and stay in touch.